The snow had buried the valley under a silence so deep that every man could hear his own heartbeat. It came down without wand, now straight and heavy, the kind of snow that erases a whole country one breath at a time. The pines stood bent under the weight of it. The rocks wore white hoods, and somewhere out in that blindness, 8 soldiers lay pressed flat to the frozen ground, waiting for a killer they could not see. Their finest marksman was already dead. He had fallen a minute earlier without a sound that anyone could place, dropped between one step and the next by a single round that had crossed more than 2,000 meters of storm to find him. The men around him had trained for years to move as one body, and now they were scattered across the snow like spilled matches, each of them alone, each of them certain that the next breath might be the last one they ever took. Among them lay a woman no one had ever expected to fight. She had spent 8 months carrying bandages and morphine and the quiet patience of someone who mends what other people break. The roster listed her as a combat medic and nothing more. She was the one who checked their blisters and their frostbite, who stitched them up and never once raised her voice. And now, in the middle of that white silence, she reached across the snow and closed her hand around the dead man's rifle. She did not hurry. She wiped the snow from the receiver with 2 fingers, the way a person clears frost from a window to see what is coming. She worked the bolt once and listened to its seat, and she let her breath go slow and long. Then she leaned close to the man who would never hear her again, and she whispered that she would finish what he had started. She rose into the storm and vanished. For a long moment there was nothing but the hiss of falling snow and the ragged breathing of frightened men. And then, far up the mountain, the first impossible shot rolled down across the valley like the closing of a great iron door. Somewhere on that ridge, a man who had been hunting them simply stopped moving. Then a second shot, then a third. One by one, the hunters began to die. And only then, lying in the snow with their ears ringing, did the survivors begin to understand the truth about the quiet woman who had carried their wounded for 8 months. The enemy on that mountain already knew her. They had learned her name in another winter, in another life, and they had taught their youngest men to be afraid of it. To understand how she came to be kneeling over a dead legend with his rifle in her hands, you have to go back. You have to go back 36 hours to the morning the trucks climbed into the Brooks Range, and no one aboard them believed for a second that any of this was real. The morning had begun with the ordinary misery of cold weather soldiering, which is to say that it had begun long before the sun. 3 trucks climbed a service road that existed on no civilian map, grinding north into the mountains while the sky was still the color of wet iron. Inside the canvas beds, the men sat knee to knee with their weapons upright between their boots, and their breath filled the air with a fog that froze on their collars and their eyelashes. This was the far edge of the American map, a place where the ranges ran on past the last road and the last radio tower and did not stop until they reached the sea ice. The Army kept a cold weather range up here for the men whose work could not be taught anywhere warm. Snipers came to this valley in the worst of the winter to learn what the cold does to a bullet and to a body and to the patience of a man lying still behind a rifle for longer than his own fear can bear. Master Sergeant Quincy Lofton rode in the lead truck with a map he had already memorized folded against his knee. He was 44 years old, and he had given more than half his life to the uniform, and the cold did not frighten him the way it frightened the young men, because he had learned a long time ago that the cold was honest. It did not lie, and it did not quit, and it treated every soul exactly the same. He counted his people twice before the trucks even reached the range, a habit worn so deep into him that he no longer knew he was doing it. 9 of them for this rotation, 8 shooters and instructors, and 1 medic. The man he trusted most in this world sat across from him in the lead truck, and his name was Jarrett Brantley. To the young candidates, Brantley was already a legend, one of those names that travels ahead of a man from post to post until the story grows larger than the man could ever be. Sergeant First Class Brantley had spent 11 years behind a rifle, and in all that time he had never missed a shot that truly mattered. He could read a valley the way a country preacher reads a room. He moved through broken ground the way water moves through a stream bed, finding the low places and the soft places in the seams that no one else could see. The candidates watched him the way boys watch their fathers, hungry for a word, and Brantley gave them very few words, because he had learned early that a man who talks too much has stopped listening to the wind. But this morning there was something riding on Brantley that Lofton had noticed and could not name. Twice on the long drive up, Brantley had keyed a radio that had nothing to do with the training schedule and had murmured into it low enough that no one else could hear. Twice he had drawn a laminated range card from the breast pocket of his parka, studied it, and put it away again without letting a single man see what was written there. Lofton had known Jarrett Brantley for 9 years. I knew the difference between a soldier turning over a training problem and a soldier turning over something that could get his people killed. He did not ask. Out here, you did not press a man like Brantley until he was ready to be pressed. You waited and you trusted and you counted your people twice. The youngest man in the trucks was a specialist named Lemuel Zeller, and everyone called him Lem. He was 21 years old and he had the kind of open face that had not yet learned how to hide anything at all. This was the hardest course the Army offered a young shooter, and Lem had talked his way into it a full year before most men were even allowed to try, and he had spent the whole ride north working hard not to show how badly the cold had already found the bones of his hands. He watched Brantley with open worship. He watched Lofton with something much closer to fear, and when he believed that no one was looking, he watched the medic, because the medic was the one person in the whole detachment that he could not begin to figure out. She sat at the tailgate, where the medics always sat, closest to the cold and closest to the way out, so that she could reach a falling man the fastest. Her name was Rosalind Ivers, and in 8 months not one man in that detachment had heard her raise her voice or offer a single word about herself that was not already written down in her file. Sergeant Ivers, combat medic, 32 years old. She carried her aid bag the way the others carried their rifles, evenly and without complaint, and she kept her scarf pulled high against the wind so that only her eyes showed above it. The men had decided, in the lazy way that soldiers decide such things, that she was simply a quiet woman who had drawn a hard posting. A woman who patched them up and stayed out of the way when the rifles began to speak. They did not know that her eyes moved differently than theirs. While the young men watched the road, her eyes climbed the ridgelines without being told to. They measured the distance to a far stand of pines, and the pitch of the slope above it, and the way the loose snow lifted and curled off an exposed shoulder of rock, and they turned all of it into numbers. Quietly, the way a musician's fingers move to a song that is playing only inside his own head. She did not choose to do it. She had spent years trying to teach herself to stop. And she had told herself every single morning for a long time now that those instincts belonged to a different woman, a woman she had buried on purpose and did not intend to dig up. Once, as the truck lurched over a frozen rut, she looked up and found Brantley already looking back at her from the far end of the bed. It lasted less than a second. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. There was a whole conversation folded inside that 1 second, something shared and old and carefully kept. And then Brantley turned back to his young men, and Rosalind turned back to the cold, and the trucks ground on up the mountain toward the range. The range itself was nothing but a scatter of frozen shapes at the head of a long, white valley. An old collapsed listening post from some forgotten decade. A few equipment sheds with their roofs bowed under snow. A command tent that cracked and shuddered in the wind like a living thing. Inside that tent, with a heater that was losing its war against the air, Lofton laid out the plan for the day while the cadre warmed their hands and said little. It was an old plan and an honest one. Before first light, a forward team of 6 candidates had already gone out to occupy the collapsed post at the far end of the valley and to play the part of an observation element under pressure. The rest of the detachment would stalk the length of the valley to reach them, moving as though every ridge held an enemy, learning again the oldest lesson of the trade, which is that a sniper is a man willing to stay patient long after patience has stopped feeling anything like courage. Brantley would walk the point, far out ahead of the main body. Lofton would hold the center, and the medic would walk at the rear, where the medics were supposed to walk. As the others filed out to gear up, Rosalind stayed a moment longer to copy the candidate manifest onto a card of her own, so that if she had to reach a wounded man, she would already know his name and his blood type before she got to him. She wrote the names in a small, even hand, one after another down the length of the page, and then her pen stopped. Halfway down that list was a name she had not allowed herself to think about in a very long time. Jessup. She sat with the pen held above the paper for the length of 3 slow breaths. Then she wrote the name, the same way she had written all the others, and she did not let her face change, and she told herself that it was a common enough name in this army, and that it meant nothing at all. She finished the list. She capped the pen, but something had shifted behind her eyes, small and cold, like the first thin crack running out across the surface of river ice. By mid-morning, the light had settled into the flat gray of a day that would never quite manage to become bright, and the detachment moved out on foot into the valley. Before they stepped in, Lofton stopped beside her in the snow. He looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he has never really needed and does not expect to need now. "Stay behind the shooters, Doc," he said. "Let the rifles do the shooting. Save your hands for after." She looked back at him with those steady eyes, and she gave him a nod that gave away absolutely nothing, and she fell into her place at the rear of the column. Lofton would remember that nod for the rest of his life. He would turn it over in his mind for years afterward, and only much later would he understand that she had already known, even then, that this day was not going to go the way that any of them had planned it. They moved through snow that reached their knees, beneath black pines bent low with ice, and the cold pressed down on them like a wide, flat hand. It was the kind of cold that does not merely chill a man, but interrogates him, that hunts down every weakness in every old injury and asks him, quietly and without mercy, how much he truly wants to keep going. The temperature stood near 40 degrees below zero. Every shooter checked his weapon twice, because at that temperature, a single drop of the wrong oil could freeze an action solid, and a rifle that will not fire is nothing but an awkward club in a dead man's hands. Nobody spoke. There was only the crunch of boots in the crust and the far-off groan of the mountains settling under its own enormous weight of snow. Once a white ptarmigan burst up out of the drift almost beneath Lemzeller's boots, exploding into the air in a spray of powder, and half the column swung their rifles toward it before their minds had caught up to their hands. Somebody let out a breath that shook on the way out. Far ahead at the point, fired at the point, Brantley did not so much as turn his head. He had heard the wings and read them and dismissed them before anyone else had even finished being afraid. Lem lowered his rifle and felt the hot shame of the young, and he glanced back once at the medic to see whether she had watched him flinch. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the ridge. Near the midpoint of the valley, Brantley raised a closed fist, and the whole column sank into the snow. He had stopped them beside a frozen creek where the ice lay blue and bare between white banks, and he crouched there for a long moment, studying the high ground ahead with a stillness that was different from his usual care. Lofton felt it too. 9 years had taught him to read the back of Brantley's neck the way other men read a change in the sky. Something up there was wrong. At the rear of the column, Rosalind had gone very still. She was looking at a shoulder of rock high on the northern ridge, a place where the tree cover thinned out and the slope fell away at an angle that a certain kind of mind simply could not stop itself from measuring. She did not know that she had stopped breathing. Every instinct she had spent years bearing was rising in her now, quiet and cold and utterly certain, telling her that the rock was not empty, that someone patient was lying behind it, that she had, in another life, lain behind 100 rocks exactly like that one, and waited for men exactly like these to walk into a valley exactly like this. She opened her mouth to call out. She was half a second too late. The sound arrived from nowhere and everywhere at once, a single flat crack that rolled down the valley and broke against the far walls. And it came from so far away that by the time they heard it, the thing it carried had already been finished. Up at the point, Jarrett Brantley went down. He did not stagger. He did not cry out. He simply folded into the snow the way a man folds when the string that has been holding him upright is cut, all at once and forever, and the white closed over him. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then the valley came apart. More shots followed, a scatter of them from different angles along the ridge, and the snow began to jump and hiss as rounds walked through the column. Men threw themselves flat. Somebody was shouting a name over and over. A candidate near the front took a round through the meat of his thigh and went down screaming into the drift. And another was clipped across the back and lay gasping with his face pressed to the ice. The rest scrambled for cover that did not exist, for the shallow folds in the low rocks that would stop nothing heavier than a hard look. And in the space of 10 seconds, The finest small unit in all that frozen country had been reduced to a handful of terrified men lying blind against the ground, leaderless at the point and bleeding into the snow. Lofton was on the radio before he had even finished sliding into cover. He called for air support in the calm, hard voice he had spent 20 years learning how to build. And the calm, hard voice that answered him told him the thing he already feared most. Nothing could fly in this. The storm had closed the sky like a lid. No aircraft would come over these mountains until the weather broke, and the weather showed no intention of breaking. Lofton lay in the snow with the dead handset pressed against his ear, and he understood, for the first time in his long career, exactly what it felt like to command men that he could not save. He looked up the valley toward the point, toward the still shape, half swallowed already by the falling snow, the shape that had been the best man he ever knew, and something in the center of his chest went quietly to ash. Rosalind was already moving. She crawled to the nearest wounded man without waiting for an order, her hands finding the wound before her mind had even finished forming the thought. Pressing, packing, binding. Her voice low and even as she told the boy that he was going to be all right, that the bleeding would stop, that all he had to do in the whole world right now was breathe. She had said these same words 100 times before. They came out of her steady and warm, while some other part of her, the part she had spent years pretending she had killed and buried, lifted her eyes to the ridge and began, without asking her permission, to work. She knew that first shot. Not the man who had made it, not yet, but the shot itself, the impossible patience folded inside it. The way it had reached across all that wind and snow and distance to touch one specific beating heart and no other. And somewhere far back inside her, on a white slope in a winter these young men had been far too small to remember. A voice she had loved was speaking low and close against her ear, telling her that the first cold shot a rifle fires is the only fully honest one it will ever give, that it confesses everything about the man behind it, if only you are quiet enough to listen. She had always been quiet enough, and lying here now with a boy's blood freezing dark on her gloves, she listened to that first cold shot still ringing in the air above the valley, and it confessed to her. When she raised her head again, her eyes had changed. They moved along the ridge in short, deliberate stops, the way a reader's eyes move down a page, and they did not search so much as confirm. There, and there, the seam of rock where the wind had scoured the snow down thin. The black gap beneath the deadfall where a patient man could lie unseen for a full day. The low hummock that looked like nothing at all and was, for exactly that reason, perfect. She counted them the way she might have counted the beats of a failing pulse under her fingers. Lofton reached her position at a low crawl, keeping his head down as another round cracked overhead and buried itself in the drift beyond them. He asked her about the wounded, and she answered him without looking up, telling him the bleeding was controlled and the boy would live if they could get him off this mountain. And then she told him the thing that stopped him cold in the snow. She told him there were 4 shooters on the ridge. Not one, not the single ghost that had taken Brantley off the board and pinned them all. 4, and she gave him their positions, one after another, in the same flat and certain voice she used to read a man's blood pressure back to him, pointing with her chin because her hands were still buried to the wrist in a wounded boy. The seam, the deadfall, the hummock, and a fourth, higher and farther back than all the rest, the one that had fired first, the one that had reached across 2,000 meters of storm to take the very best of them before the others even understood that they had walked into a fight. Lofton stared at her. Snow was gathering on his eyelashes. He was a man who had spent his entire life around shooters, and he knew beyond any argument that what she had just done was not possible for a medic. It was barely possible for a master. He asked her, his voice gone rough in his throat, how in God's name she could possibly know that. She looked at him then, and something old and steady and very tired settled behind her eyes, something that had nothing at all to do with bandages or morphine. Because those are the 4 places I would have chosen, she said. Lofton had no answer for that. There was no answer for it. He watched her finish tying off the wounded boy with hands that did not shake, and he watched her lift her gaze up the valley towards the point, toward Brantley, and he saw something cross her face that he had never once seen there in 8 months of sharing the same cold. Not fear, grief, old grief, worn smooth as a creek stone, the kind a person carries for so long that it becomes part of the very way they stand. Then she did the thing that not one of them would ever forget for as long as they lived. She rose up off the wounded man and began to move up the valley, low and fast, toward the point where Brantley had fallen and where his long rifle lay half buried in the snow beside him, wrapped in its own ragged shroud of burlap and garnish, so that it looked less like a weapon than like a part of the mountain itself. Lemzeller caught her by the arm as she passed him. He was 21 years old and he did not fully understand what he was doing, only that they had already lost the best man on this mountain and that he could not stand to watch them lose the quiet woman who had bandaged his blistered hands. "You are a medic," he said. His voice cracked in the cold. "This is not your job." She looked down at his hand where it gripped her sleeve. "We cannot lose you too," he said. She looked from his hand up to his young, frightened face. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and absolute, the way a thing is quiet when it has already been decided long ago. "Today is not about what I am," she told him. "Today, we bring everyone home." And then she took her arm back from him, gently the way you take something back from a child, and she went on up the valley alone. She reached Brantley in the lee of a boulder where the snow had already drifted over half of his body. She knelt down beside him. For a moment she did nothing at all. Then she brushed the snow from his face with the back of her glove, slowly and with great care, and she closed his eyes with 2 fingers the way she had closed the eyes of other men before him, and she bent down low, close to his ear. The men who lay near enough to hear it said afterward that she spoke a name to him. Not Brantley, not Jarrett, a name that none of them had ever heard in their lives. A short, hard word that sounded like it belonged to a war too old for any of the young ones in that valley to remember. She said it the way you say a name you have already said 10,000 times in the dark. She said it the way you say goodbye to the last living person who ever knew who you used to be. "Rest now, Ironside," she said so low that the wind nearly stole it. "I have the gun." Lofton was close enough to hear her, and though he had known Jarrett Brantley for 9 long years, had bled in the same ditches beside him, and buried the same friends beside him, and trusted the man with his own life, more times than he could ever count, he had never once in all those years heard a single soul called Jarrett Brantley by the name Ironside. It was not in his file. It was not on any roster that Lofton had ever been given to read. It belonged to some sealed part of the man's life that the Army kept locked in a drawer it did not open for people like Lofton. And the only person on this entire mountain who seemed to hold a key to that drawer was a quiet medic that every last one of them had spent 8 months failing to truly see. Rosalind Ivers lifted the dead man's rifle up out of the snow. She brushed the frozen crust from the receiver with the flat of her thumb. She drew the bolt back and rode it home, and she let her breath run out long and slow, down into the old rhythm, the one that lived beneath all of her other rhythms, the one that had never once truly left her in all the years she had pretended it was gone. She settled the shrouded weapon back against a shoulder that remembered, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly how to hold it. And then she rose up into the storm and was gone, up into the white, up toward the place where 4 patient men lay waiting. And not one of them yet had any idea that the winter itself had just changed sides. Behind her, down in the snow, Lofton keyed a radio that would not answer him and held in his mouth a name he had never heard. And above them all, the mountain went on falling steadily into white, filling her tracks 1 flake at a time, as though the storm had quietly agreed to keep her secret just a little while longer. They would learn her name before this day was over. So would the men who had come across these mountains to kill them. But all of that was still ahead, up on the high ground, in the long hours of patience and blood that were still waiting to be lived. For now there was only the snow, and the wounded, and the vanishing shape of a woman that the United States Army had listed as nothing more than a medic, climbing up alone into the storm toward 4 hidden rifles, with the weapon of a dead legend cradled in her arms, and all the buried years of a life she had tried to leave behind rising up quietly to meet her. The mountain took her the way it takes everything. Slowly and without mercy, and she gave herself to it the way she had been taught a lifetime ago. She climbed for the better part of an hour, and every step of it was a decision. She did not walk. She flowed low against the slope, reading the ground the way she had once read it every day of her life, choosing the deadfall and the boulder and the wind-scoured seam of rock, staying always in the places where a watching eye would find nothing but more snow. Her body remembered things her mind had spent years trying to forget. The way to set a boot down heel first and let it sink without sound. The way to freeze between gusts and move only when the wind moved with her. The way to become over long, patient minutes. Less a person on a mountain than a part of the mountain itself. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves before she found the place she wanted. Her heartbeat had slowed to the old deliberate rhythm, the one that let a shooter hold still enough to disappear. She settled into the snow behind a low shelf of granite with the dead man's rifle cradled against her. And she looked down the long white throat of the valley, and for the first time in 6 years, she was exactly where she had spent so long, swearing she would never be again. Below her, small and scattered and bleeding, lay the men she had come up here to save. She did not think about that. She could not afford to think about that. She thought about wind. The wind was the whole world now. It swept down off the exposed rock above her, and it curled through the pines, and it bent the falling snow into long gray ribbons that told her, if she was quiet enough to listen, exactly what a bullet would do out there in all that cold, empty air. She read the ribbons. She read the way the powder lifted off a far drift and hung and fell. She read the thin blue plume of ice crystals streaming off the shoulder of the northern ridge. And she did the arithmetic without words. The way a man who has driven the same road for 30 years takes a curve without ever deciding to. The first shooter lay in the seam of rock she had marked from below. Howe was good. She gave him that. He had chosen his hide well, and he had held it with discipline, and he had spent the last hour firing down into the pinned men with the calm economy of a professional. He was good, and it did not matter, because he had learned his trade in a warm country from men who had never once had to shoot through 40 degrees of Arctic cold. And she had learned hers here, in exactly this, in the one kind of shooting on Earth that could not be faked or hurried or bought. She breathed out. She waited for the space between heartbeats. She sent the round. 600 meters down the slope, in the seam of rock, the shooter simply stopped. His rifle slid from his hands and went still against the stone, and he folded down into his own hide and did not move again. And the men he had been killing looked up in confusion at a mountain that had, for one impossible moment, decided to fight on their side. Down in the snow of the valley floor, Master Sergeant Quincy Lofton heard the shot and could not place it. It had not come from the ridge where the enemy lay. It had come from somewhere above and behind the enemy, from the high broken ground where no sane man would climb in this weather, and it had been followed by a silence from the seam of rock that had been spitting fire at his people for the last 20 minutes. He pressed himself lower and keyed his radio out of pure habit and got nothing, and understood that whatever was happening up there was happening without him, beyond his reach, beyond his command. He thought of the quiet medic climbing alone into the storm, and he did not let himself believe it, because believing it would have meant believing too many other things. High on the ridge, in a hide the white ghost herself had not yet located, a man named Brigham Wingate lowered his spotting scope and went very still. He had felt something change. He had spent his whole life in this work, and a man does not survive as long as Brigham Wingate had survived without developing a sense for the moment a hunt turns over and becomes something else. His first shooter had gone quiet, not killed in a firefight, not caught in the open, but erased, cleanly, from above and behind, by a single round out of dead ground that no amateur could have used. He swept his scope across the high slope where the shot must have come from, and he saw nothing, which told him more than anything else could have. Empty snow that should not have been empty, a silence shaped exactly like a person. He keyed his net and called his second shooter and told him to watch the high ground. I did not get an answer, because by then Rosalind Ivers had already moved. She had eased back out of her first position the instant the round left the barrel, sliding backward through the snow on her elbows, disturbing as little of the surface as a person can disturb and still travel, and she had crossed 40 yards of broken slope to a new shelf of rock while the echo was still rolling down the valley. This was the thing the legends always got wrong about her in the years when there had still been legends. They spoke of impossible shots, of bullets that defied the wind and the curve of the earth. But the truth of her had never been the shooting. The truth of her had always been the patience and the moving and the terrible discipline of a person who understood that speed is almost always the enemy of staying alive. The second shooter lay behind the deadfall, and he was looking the wrong way. She watched him for a full 2 minutes before she fired. She watched him search the high ground for the ghost that had killed his partner. And she watched his fear grow, the small betraying movements of a man who has just understood that he is no longer the hunter. And when at last he shifted his weight to bring his rifle around, she sent the round through the meat of his shoulder and through the receiver of his weapon and into the frozen log behind him. And she took him out of the war without taking him out of the world. She did not fire again to finish him. She let him lie there, alive in ruin and no longer a threat, and she was already crawling backward toward her next position before he had finished falling. Down below, pressed against a rock with a dead radio in his fist, Lem Zeller had crawled to Lofton's side, and the boy was staring up the mountain with an expression the older man would remember for the rest of his life. "She's not killing them," Lem said. Lofton looked at him. "The first one," the boy said, "and now she is putting them down and leaving them alive. I saw it. Through the scope. She could have finished him, and she did not." Lofton did not answer because he had no answer, because it made no sense. A woman alone on a mountain against a team of professional killers does not leave her enemies breathing behind her. Every rule of the trade said to finish them. Every instinct in Lofton's own long body said to finish them. A wounded man can still key a radio. A wounded man can still call for his friends. Leaving them alive was not mercy up here. Leaving them alive was a risk that could get her killed and everyone below her killed with her. And yet she was doing it on purpose. The boy was right. She was doing it deliberately, the way she did everything, and that meant there was a reason, and the not knowing of it settled into Lofton's chest like a cold stone. He looked up the mountain, and for the first time he began to be afraid of a different thing than the enemy. She found the answer herself 10 minutes later in a dead man's radio. She had reached the second shooter's hide to recover anything useful. And there, still clipped to his gear, was a handset, and it was live, and it was speaking. She lay in the snow beside the ruined man, and she listened to the enemy net, and what she heard turned the whole shape of the day around. It was a check-in, a cold, disciplined, timed check-in, the kind that only a serious outfit runs. A controller somewhere down the valley was going down a list, calling his stations one by one, and each station was answering with a number and a word, a challenge and a countersign. "Gospel," one station said. "Iron," the controller answered. Then the next, then the next. And she understood, lying there in the snow with the dead man's radio against her ear, that these men were not a gang of thieves who had stumbled into a fight. They were something far more careful than that. They ran their communications the way she had once run hers, on a schedule, with a rotating countersign, so that the moment a station went silent or answered wrong, everyone would know. And then the controller said the thing that froze her. He called a station she had not heard before, a station down at the far end of the valley, and he asked it for a status on what he called the packages. And a voice answered, bored and certain, that the packages were secure, all 6 of them, cold but breathing, and would stay that way exactly as long as the net stayed clean. 6, cold but breathing, the forward team, the young men who had gone out before dawn to play at war and had walked instead into a real one. They were alive, held at the far end of the valley by the rear element of this outfit, and they were alive for one reason only, because the net was clean, because every station had answered, because no one down there yet knew that anything had gone wrong up here on the ridge. And she understood, all at once and completely, the trap she was standing in the middle of. If she killed these shooters, they would miss their check-in. If they missed their check-in, the net would know. And the moment the net knew, 6 young men at the far end of the valley would be executed in the snow, and their killers would vanish into a storm that no aircraft could fly through. She could not kill her way up this ridge. She had never been able to. From the very first shot she had known, somewhere beneath knowing, that the only way through this was to take these men off the board without taking them off the net, to put them down and then to answer for them, to keep the whole machine humming along as though nothing on this mountain had changed at all, while underneath it, everything changed. It was a thing almost no one alive could do. It required her to know their exact procedure, their timing, their challenge, and their countersign, the particular flat cadence that a tired professional uses on a radio at the far edge of the world. And she did know it. She knew all of it. She knew it in her hands and her mouth before she had time to wonder how she knew it. And the knowing of it was a door into a room she had kept locked for 6 years, and she did not open that door now, because there was no time, and because some part of her was afraid of what still lived inside it. The check-in wheeled around the net toward the station she was now holding in her hand. The controller calls the number. He gave the challenge, gospel. Rosalind Ivers keyed the dead man's radio, and in a voice that was not her own, flat and bored and exactly right, she gave the countersign that she should not have known. Iron, she said, and the net believed her. The controller moved on down his list without a pause, and the machine kept humming, and 6 young men at the far end of the valley kept breathing, and Rosin lay in the snow and let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like her entire life. She had bought them time, not safety, time. The next check-in would come, and the one after that, and each one would be a small door she had to walk through without stumbling. And all the while she had a ridge to clear, and a storm closing down, and a wound she did not yet know she was about to take. The third shooter almost ended it. He was on the hummock, and he was not a fool, and he had spent the last 10 minutes doing exactly what she was doing, which was looking for the shape in the snow that did not belong. She had grown a hair less careful because she had a radio against her ear and a schedule in her head and too many things to hold at once. And as she rose to shift toward him, he caught the movement, and he was fast, and he was good. And the round he sent came close enough to part the air against her cheek before she even heard the crack of it. She rolled. The second round tore through the snow where she had been. She came up behind a spine of granite with her heart hammering against the old rhythm. And for the space of 3 seconds, it was not patience anymore. It was not craft anymore. It was two professionals, a few hundred meters apart, trying to kill each other before the other one could. And in a fight like that, the winner is simply whoever was calmer first. She had been calm longer than almost anyone alive. She let him fire again, and she marked the muzzle by its disturbance in the falling snow. And while he was working his bolt, she came up over the granite and put a round through his shoulder and his radio in one stroke and dropped back down before his answering round could find her. When she looked again, he was down, alive, disarmed, out of it. And the third of the 4 hides that had murdered her people had gone silent. But the fourth round he had fired, the one that had gone wide as she came up, had not gone wide. She felt it a half second after it happened, the way a person always does. The sensation arriving late as if her body had wanted to spare her the news as long as it could. A line of white fire opened across the top of her right shoulder. Warmth spread beneath her parka, dark and quick, and the arm that had held a rifle steady through more years than she cared to count began, for the first time in her life, to tremble. The old wound was there. It had always been there, a knot of scar high on that same right shoulder, a souvenir of a winter 6 years gone that she had never once explained to a single soul in her current life. She had favored that arm for 6 years. She had learned to lift it only so far, to reach for the high shelf in the aid station with her left hand out of a habit the men had never thought to question. And now the mountain had opened her up in exactly the same place, as if it knew, as if the past had reached up through all that snow to find the oldest hurt she owned and press its thumb against it. She packed the wound with her own hand, tied it off with a strip of cloth in her teeth, and she did not make a sound. She had work to do. She settled back behind the rifle and forced her breathing down into the 4 count. Her whole body knew, 4 in, 4 held, 4 out, and she waited for the trembling to pass, and slowly, because she willed it to, it passed. It was then, lying wounded in the snow at the top of the world, that his voice came onto the net. She knew it before he said a word. She knew it the way you know a voice you once trusted more than your own, the way you know a voice that has spoken to you across the worst days a life can hold. It had aged, it had gone at the edges. But it was his, and when it came onto the net, it did not give a number or a countersign because he was not a station on anyone's list. He was the man the whole net answered to. "Hello, Winterkill," Brigham Wingate said, and 6 years fell away beneath her like ice giving out underfoot. For a moment, she was not on the ridge at all. For a moment, she was somewhere else entirely, on another slope, in another storm, listening to that same voice say her name in the dark while the numbers rolled between them, shooter and spotter, 2 halves of one weapon, back when the name Winterkill had meant something, and the man who spoke it had been the person she trusted to keep her alive. The memory lasted no longer than a breath. It came with a smell of cold gun oil and a fragment of a sentence. his younger voice telling her that the wind on a mountain always lies twice, once with its mouth and once with its silence, and that the second lie is the one that kills you. She had lived on that sentence for 11 years. She lived on it now. And as fast as it had come, it was gone again, because he was still talking, and every word he said was a hook going into her. I wondered if it was you, Wingate said. Nobody else shoots like a saint. She did not answer. She lay in the snow, and she pressed her wounded shoulder into the cold to slow the blood, and she listened, because listening was how you learned where a man was, and because some part of her could not have answered if she had wanted to. They told me you were finished, he said. They told me you put down the rifle and went and learned to sew men up instead. And here you are, on my mountain, still pretending you are something you are not. The net was silent under his voice. His own men were listening. The young men down the valley, if their captured ears could hear it, were listening. And Wingate knew it, and he was enjoying it, and he turned the knife the way only a man who knows exactly where you are soft can turn it. Does the boy down there know what you are? He said. The young one who grabbed your arm. Does he know how many you have left in the snow over the years? You left two on a mountain like this once. You remember, ask her, all of you. Ask her about the grid. Ask her whose fault it was. And there it was, the grid, the two she had left. The old wound opened wider than any bullet could open it, and she lay in the snow with her name in a dead enemy's mouth and her past bleeding out of her faster than her shoulder. And for one terrible moment, the discipline of 11 years wavered. She wanted to answer him. She wanted, more than she had wanted anything in 6 years, to key that radio and tell the whole frozen valley the truth about the grid and whose fault it truly was. But the truth was a long story, and a long story was a location, and a location was a bullet. And so she pressed her mouth shut, and she pressed her shoulder into the snow, and she said nothing at all, and the silence cost her more than the wound. Down in the valley, Lem Zeller had heard the name. The enemy net had bled across a frequency, his own dead radio still caught in fragments. And the boy had heard a rough voice say a word he did not understand. Winterkill, and he had heard it say something about a grid, and two men left in the snow, and he was too young to know what any of it meant. But he was not too young to see what it was doing to the men around him. He saw Lofton go pale beneath the frost on his face. He saw the older instructors look at one another with something he had never seen in their faces before, a kind of awe that was very close to fear. "Who is Winterkill?" Lem asked. No one answered him, and the not answering was its own answer, and it frightened the boy more than the shooting had. Up on the ridge, Wingate was still talking, and his voice had changed. The mockery had cooled into something flatter and more patient, the voice of a man settling in behind a rifle for the long work. "You cannot save them all," he said. "You know that better than anyone breathing. You could not save two. Now there are six, and there is you, and there is me, and this time there is no report to hide behind when it is over. This time everyone gets to watch." She began to move. Wounded, bleeding, one arm gone unreliable beneath her. She began to ease herself out of the position he had almost surely already marked, because the first rule was still the first rule, and a shooter who stays where his voice was heard is a dead shooter. She slid backward through the snow toward a fold of ground that would let her cross to the higher shelf where the fourth hide waited, the hide she had marked from the very beginning, the one the first killing shot had come from, the one she now knew belonged to him. And that was when Lem Zeller did the bravest and most foolish thing of his young life. He could not reach her. He could not fight the ghosts on the ridge. But he could see, from where he lay, that the wounded medic who had carried him for 8 months was leaving a track of blood across the white, and that one of the disabled shooters below her had begun to crawl, slow and broken, but crawling, toward a fallen radio that could still betray her. And so the boy came up out of his cover, against every order and every instinct, and he ran. He ran low and hard, across the open snow of the valley floor, toward that crawling man in that fallen radio, 21 years old and unarmed, but for the rifle in his hands, running to protect a woman he did not understand from a danger she could not see. Lofton screamed at him to get down. On the high ridge, in his hide, Brigham Wingate saw the boy break cover, and he smiled, because he understood at once what the boy was, and he understood at once what the boy would make her do. He swung the long .50 caliber rifle down off the high ground, away from the ghost he had been hunting, and he laid the reticle on the running child, and he let the woman on the mountain understand, in the space of a single held breath, the choice he was about to force on her: to stay hidden and let the boy die, or to save him, and in the saving of him, to show a master exactly where she was. The wind died for less than 2 seconds, a rare, perfect stillness in a storm that had shown no mercy all day. A single shot cracked across the frozen valley, and then there was only the snow, falling and falling, and the silence, and no one down in that white bowl of a world could say whose rifle had spoken, or which of the 3 lives on that mountain had just ended in the cold. For the length of one breath, the valley held every life inside it suspended, and then the truth of the shot revealed itself the way all truths reveal themselves on a mountain, slowly and only to those still alive to see it. The boy was still running. That was the first thing. Lem Zeller was still running, stumbling now, thrown off his stride by the crack of a rifle that had passed close enough to burn the air beside his face. But running, alive, whole. And high on the ridge, the long 50 caliber rifle that should have ended him lay knocked sideways in the snow, its optics shattered into a blind eye, its shooter reeling back from a blow that had come out of the empty white behind him. Because in the 2 seconds the wind had died, Rosalind Ivers had made a choice, and the choice had not been to hide. She had fired a heartbeat before he did. She had put her round not through the man, but through the machine, through the receiver and the glass of the heavy rifle he had leveled on the child, and the great 50 caliber round he sent an instant later had gone wide by the exact width of a spoiled aim, screaming off into the storm a full arm's length from the boy's head. She had saved Lem Zeller, and she had done it in the only way left to her, by showing Brigham Wingate and every living eye on that mountain precisely where she lay. She did not wait to see the boy reach cover. She was already moving, sliding backward off the burned position. Because a shooter who has been seen is a shooter who is already dying. And she had perhaps 10 seconds before the man on the ridge brought up a second weapon and made her pay for the child's life with her own. Down in the valley, Lofton caught Lem by the collar and dragged him the last few feet into cover. And the boy was shaking, and the boy was weeping the way the young weep when they have just learned that the world is real. And Lofton held him against the rock and understood at last what he had spent all day refusing to understand. The quiet medic had not come up this mountain to fight. She had come up here to spend herself, to trade her own life, piece by piece, for theirs. And she had just paid the largest piece of it to save a boy who had grabbed her arm that morning and told her that this was not her job. Lofton looked down at his own hands, and then at the still shape of Jarrett Brantley, half buried in the snow at the point, and something in the old soldier finally broke open. I had known Brantley for 9 years, and he had never known him at all. He crawled to the dead man now, through the fire, because the enemy on the ridge had turned all his attention to the ghost on the high ground, and the valley floor had gone quiet, and he reached the body and he began, with numb and clumsy hands, to go through the kit of the man he had trusted more than his own brother. And there, in a waterproof pouch against Brantley's chest, beneath the range card with its single blacked-out grid square, Lofton found 2 things that turned the whole day inside out. The first was a photograph, old and soft at the corners, of a sniper team in a snowfield in a country the caption did not name. 6 of them, in ghillie suits, their faces young and hard. And though the years had worked on all of them, Lofton could pick out 3 faces without effort. A younger Brantley, unsmiling in the center, the way a team leader stands. A younger Brigham Wingate at the left edge, already wearing the smile of a man who has decided the rules are for other people. And on the right, kneeling, cradling a long rifle as though it were the only thing in the world she trusted, a woman with steady eyes that Lofton had spent 8 months walking past without ever once seeing. On the net, in that forgotten war, they had carried other names than the ones the Army printed in their files. The kneeling woman with the rifle had been called Winterkill. The unsmiling man in the center, the leader who held them all together, had been called Ironside, and now Lofton knew at last where the medic had learned a name that lived on no roster he had ever read. And the smiling one at the edge, the spotter whose voice had called her wind across 1,000 shots, they had called hearse. Because in the end, that was the only thing he ever truly carried. The second thing was a single sheet of paper, folded small, and it was a copy of an old after-action report, and across the top of it, a hand that Lofton knew as well as his own had written 4 words. She never missed. Wingate. And in the lee of a boulder a mile up the mountain, wounded and bleeding and out of time, the woman in the photograph was remembering the day that piece of paper was written. It came to her the way the past always came to her, without permission, triggered by his voice still ringing in her ears. Ask her about the grid. Ask her whose fault it was. 6 years fell away. She was on another slope, in another storm, and she was the rifle and he was the eyes, the way they had been for years. Shooter and spotter, two halves of one weapon, and she trusted the numbers he gave her the way you trust your own heartbeat. A team was moving in the open below, her team, her people, and the enemy was closing, and she was waiting on his call for the grid that would let her break up the assault before it reached them. And he gave her a grid, and it was wrong. It was wrong by just enough, a deliberate and beautiful lie in the mouth of the one man on earth she would never have thought to doubt. And by the time she understood that the numbers did not match the ground, it was already too late. And two men she had sworn to bring home were dying in a place her rifle could no longer reach. One of them was a young sergeant named Sewell Jessup, who had a wife and a boy back home, and who had once given her his own gloves on a cold night and told her to keep her hands warm because the team needed them. She came back to the present with the boy's name still in her mouth and the truth of it burning like a coal she had swallowed 6 years ago and never been able to bring up. They had cleared her in the end. The record showed no criminal fault, but a spotter's call is a spoken thing, gone the instant it is made, and a shooter's round is a written thing, a hole in the world that stays. And when the board looked for someone to carry the weight of two dead men, they looked at the one whose finger had been on the trigger. Wingate had let them. Wingate had stood in that room with his clean smile and let her carry it. And then he had taken his skills to men who paid in cash and no questions. And she had downed the rifle forever and gone to learn how to close wounds instead of opening them, because she could not live one more day as the instrument of another man's lie. And Jarrett Brantley had believed her. Brantley alone. Brantley had spent 6 years hunting the truth and the man who owned it. And he had followed Wingate to these mountains. And he had pulled every string he had left to get her posted to this range beside him. Not as a shooter, never again as a shooter, but as the one person alive who could recognize Wingate's hand in the dark. That was why he had gone quiet on the drive up. That was why he had kept a grid square blacked out on a card against his heart. He had brought her here to finish it, and Wingate had killed him for it with the first cold shot of the morning, because Wingate had always known, better than anyone, exactly how dangerous the truth could be. She understood all of it now, lying in the snow with her old wound open and her old name spoken aloud on an enemy net. And she understood, with a clarity that steadied her trembling arm, what she had to do. Not kill him. Killing him, bury the truth under the snow with everything else. She had to take him alive, and she had to make him say it, out loud on a net the whole world was listening to, so that two dead men and one buried woman could finally come home. Down below, Lofton was already moving toward her, and he was carrying something long across his back. He had found it staged beside Brantley's position, wrapped in a drag bag and waiting, the tool a hunter brings when he means to reach across a valley and touch a specific man. A heavy .50 caliber rifle, the twin of the one on the ridge, sighted and loaded and ready by the hand of a dead legend who had known exactly who he was coming here to kill. Lofton climbed through the storm with the weapon on his back and the range card in his fist. And he could not have said aloud exactly why he was doing it, only that the best man he ever knew had prepared this, had wanted this, and that the woman up the mountain was the only one who could finish what Brantley had started. He found her in the rocks, gray-faced and steady, and he laid the rifle in the snow beside her, and he put the range card into her bloody glove. "He came here for this," Lofton said. His voice was rough. "For you, for him." She looked at the blacked-out grid square on the card, the location Brantley had died protecting, the hide where Wingate would go to ground for the final reckoning, and she nodded once. "Finish it, Winterkill," Lofton said. And in saying her name, the real one, the buried one, the old soldier gave her back a thing she had not owned in 6 years. Not forgiveness. She had never needed forgiveness. Belief. He believed her, without being told, the way Brantley had believed her, and it was enough. Shot took up the heavy rifle. The duel that followed would be told for as long as any man who saw it drew breath. and none of them who told it would ever be believed. It was fought across 2,400 meters of storm-battered mountain, a distance so great that neither shooter could see the other as anything more than a suggestion, a wrongness in the snow, a shadow that fell where no shadow should. Both of them knew that a single mistake, a single moment of impatience, a single breath taken at the wrong instant, would end it. And so they did the thing their whole terrible art was built on. They waited. She found his hide exactly where the cards said it would be, high on the far ridge in a fold of rock that commanded the whole valley. And she knew he was in it the way she knew her own name, because it was the hide she would have chosen herself, because he had taught her to choose it. That was the horror and the truth of fighting Brigham Wingate. He knew every thought she had before she finished thinking it, and she knew every thought he had. Because for years they had shared one mind across the numbers, and the numbers were the only language either of them had ever fully spoken. She settled the heavy rifle. She read the wind. It came down the valley in long gray ribbons, and she read them the way she had read them all her life, and she began to build the shot, adjusting for the drop across all that distance in the drift of the round and the slow turning of the earth beneath the bullet's long flight. And then, as she built it, the wind began to die. It died the way it had died before the shot that saved the boy. A stillness spread across the valley, a rare and perfect calm, the kind of window a shooter waits an entire career to be given. Every instinct she owned told her to take it. The air was still. The flags of blowing snow had gone slack. It was the moment. It was the gift. And somewhere far across the valley, she knew, Brigham Wingate was giving it to her. Because he had taught her, on a slope like this one a lifetime ago, that the wind on a mountain lies twice. Once with its mouth, when it blows and shows you a lie you can see and correct. And once with its silence, when it goes still and shows you nothing at all, and lets you believe the nothing, and kills you with the current you cannot see moving high above the valley floor where the snow does not reach to betray it. The second lie is the one that kills you. He had said it to her 10,000 times. He had said it to her the way a man says a thing he believes is only ever a lesson, never once dreaming it would come back across the years to be used against him. She did not take the still air. She lay in the perfect calm that every part of her body screamed at her to trust, and she did not trust it. And instead she read the high country, the plume of ice crystals, streaming off the distant summit 2,000 feet above the dead valley floor. The true wind, the hidden one, the current that was even now waiting to reach out and push her round a full body's width to the right if she believed the silence at her own level. She held for a wind that no eye could see and no still flag would confirm. She held for the lie beneath the lie. She built the shot on the truth he had given her and the truth he had forgotten he had given her, and she let her breath go out, long and slow, down into the old rhythm, the one that had never left her, the one he had once counted for her in the dark. Across the valley, in his hide, Brigham Wingate waited for a round that would fly true into a wind he had hidden, and drift wide and miss, and give him the half-second he needed to answer it and end her. The round did not drift. She sent it into the still and secret air, and it crossed 2,400 meters of storm on a line she had bent to meet a wind that no one else on that mountain even knew was there. And it arrived exactly where 6 years and one dead legend and 2 men in the snow had sent it. It did not find his heart. She had promised herself that. It found the heavy rifle in his hands, and it tore the weapon out of them and flung it down the rocks. And it took the last 2 fingers of his right hand with it, the hand that called the wind, the hand that had written a lie into a grid and let a woman carry it for 6 years. And Brigham Wingate, disarmed and broken and screaming into the snow, understood at last that the student had not missed. The student never missed. That had always been the whole problem. She was up and moving before the echo died, down off her position and across the saddle of the ridge, the heavy rifle traded now for Brantley's bolt gun, closing the distance to the man in the rocks with the long, patient stride of someone who has waited 6 years for exactly this and will not hurry it now. She came over the lip of his hide and she found him on his back in the red snow, cradling the ruin of his hand. And for the first time in 6 years, she looked Brigham Wingate in the eye, down the length of a rifle instead of across the numbers. "You should have killed me," he said. Blood was on his teeth. The old smile tried to come and could not. You never could understand, she said, why I would not. He looked up at her, and something moved behind his eyes, some last calculation, some final search for the lie that had always saved him before. And he did not find it. Perhaps, at the end, there was simply nowhere left in him to hide it. You left them, he said. It was the old accusation, the one he had thrown across the net an hour ago, the one he had let a board believe 6 years ago, and he threw it now out of pure habit, the way a broken thing keeps trying to do what it was built to do. No, she said, and she crouched beside him, and she took the enemy radio from his gear with her free hand, and she keyed it so that the whole net, and the 6 young men waiting to die at the far end of the valley, and the Army headquarters now patched into the frequency by a master sergeant a mile below, could hear every word. You left them, I stayed. Then she pressed the handset against his bloody mouth, and she told him the only terms he was ever going to get. His life, which she would not take, in exchange for the truth which he had taken from her. The location of the packages, spoken clean into the net, so his own rear element would stand down and the 6 would live, and the grid, the old grid, whose call it had been. For a long moment he said nothing, and the storm poured down over both of them, and she watched him weigh the last thing he owned, which was a lie, against the first thing he had felt in 6 years, which might have been shame, or might only have been exhaustion. And then Brigham Wingate keyed the truth into the net in a flat and beaten voice, the location of the 6, and the order to release them. And then, after a silence so long she thought he would take it to the grave, the rest of it. He said that the grid had been his call. He said that she had never missed. He said that he had sold the position and let her carry the dead, and that the report was a lie, and that the woman they had all buried under another woman's name had done nothing that cold day but exactly what he told her to do. A mile below in the command tent, a headquarters that had spent 6 years with her name written wrong in a sealed file, heard a dead legend's suspicion become a living traitor's confession. And it was recorded, every word, onto a channel that could never again be unheard. And that was how the white ghost came home, not with a shot, with the truth. The storm broke an hour before dark. It broke the way Arctic storms do, all at once, the wind falling away and the clouds tearing open to show a sky the color of cold iron going slowly to rose. And into that narrow window of clearing air, the helicopters finally came, beating up the valley low and heavy, the sound of them rolling ahead like a promise kept. Lofton took his men forward under Rosalind's overwatch, and she lay above them on the heavy rifle one last time, guarding the approach, ready to reach out and disable any weapon that so much as turned toward the men she had bled all day to reach. None did. Wingate's rear element, hearing their leader broken on the net and their overwatch gone silent, and the aircraft in the sky at last, chose their own lives over their orders and melted back into the mountains. And the collapsed listening post at the far end of the valley fell without another shot. Inside it, huddled together in a shelter that had very nearly become their grave, were 6 young soldiers, cold and starved and hollow-eyed, but alive, all 6. And as Lofton's men brought them up out of the dark one by one into the last light of the day, Rosalind came down off the ridge to meet them, because she had to, because some part of her had known, since a pen stopped over a manifest that morning, exactly who she would find in that shelter. I was the 4th one out, young, too young, gray with cold, and when he lifted his face to the men pulling him free, she read the name stitched across his chest, the name she had written on a card that morning and told herself meant nothing. The name of the man whose worn gloves had once warmed her own hands on a night nearly as cold as this one. Jessup. He did not know her. How could he? He knew only that a shape in a bloody parka had come down off the mountain that had held them all day, and that the shooting had stopped, and that he was going to see his mother again. He looked at her with the dazed gratitude of the rescued, and he said the only thing he had the strength to say. You came for us, he said. And Rosalind Ivers, who had spent 6 years unable to save his father, and one long day making certain she would save him, looked at the boy with the steady eyes that had frightened and comforted a whole detachment, and she did not tell him, she would never tell him. Some debts are paid in silence, in the space behind a soldier's face, in a warmth handed down across the years from a dead man's gloves to his living son. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder, the way she had put her hands on 100 wounded men. I came to bring everyone home, she said, and she carried the last of the 6 down out of the snow herself. They took Brigham Wingate out on the same flight as the men he had tried to kill, alive, as she had promised. his ruined hand wrapped in a medic's careful dressing that she had applied without a word or a change in her face. Because she was a medic, and that was the whole truth of what she had become, and she would not let even him die of a wound she could close. He watched her work over him with something that was almost wonder, and he did not speak, and neither did she. And that silence was the last thing that ever passed between the two halves of a weapon that had once been the most feared name in a war the world had agreed to forget. At the forward base, in the hours that followed, the story came apart and put itself back together in the way that such stories do. A sealed file was opened, an old report was struck, and a senior officer, older than Lofton and grayer, came to find the quiet medic where she sat alone with her wounded shoulder freshly stitched. And he told her that the record would be corrected, and that Jarrett Brantley's last transmission, sent minutes before he died, had already named her as Winterkill and named Wingate as the man they should have been hunting all along. The dead legend's final act on this earth had been to clear her. He had died with her true name in his mouth, defending it, the way she had knelt in the snow and spoken his. Then the officer offered her the thing that men in his position always believe is the greatest gift they can give: a full return to the program, her rank restored and lifted, a promotion and a permanent posting to lead the training of the next generation of shooters, to take everything she was and pour it into the young men who would come after. It was, he told her, the least the Army owed the finest rifle it had ever fielded. She considered it for exactly as long as courtesy required. Then she declined. She told him, quietly, without heat, that she had put down the rifle a long time ago and had picked it up this once, only because 6 men needed to come home and one dead friend needed the truth told over him. Taking a shot, she said, had only ever been worth doing because someone she loved was on the other end of it, waiting to be saved. She had no wish to go back to a life built around the weapon. She had found, in 8 months of closing wounds and warming frozen hands and sitting with frightened boys in the dark, a way to matter that had nothing to do with distance or wind or the slow turning of the earth beneath a bullet. She would keep it. The officer did not push her. Something in her steady eyes told him there was no push that would move her, and that a wiser man than himself had probably learned that lesson long ago and gone to his grave still honoring it. She left the base before dawn the next morning, before the cameras and the questions and the careful men from headquarters could arrive. The way she had done everything in her life that mattered, quietly and alone. Lem Zeller found her at the edge of the airfield in the blue dark, shouldering a simple pack, and the boy who had grabbed her arm a lifetime ago tried to find the words for a thing far too large for a man his age to hold. And he could not. And so he simply told her that he was sorry, and that he had been wrong about her. She told him he had nothing to be sorry for. She told him that most people misjudge the quiet ones, and that the mistake had cost him nothing in the end, and that he was going to be a fine shooter one day, better than fine, if he remembered that the rifle was only ever a tool for bringing people home, and never once let anyone teach him otherwise. Then she pressed something into his hand. It was Brantley's range card, worn soft at the edges. The single blacked-out grid square that had held Wingate's hide had been filled in now in her own small, even hand, a hunt finished, a debt closed. But there was a second blacked-out square on that card. Lem had not noticed it before. A second grid, somewhere far to the east of these mountains, that Jarrett Brantley had marked and never lived to explain, and that the woman standing before him had studied for a long time in the blue dark before she folded the card and gave it away. "What is this one?" the boy asked. She looked at him, and for just a moment something crossed her steady eyes that he would think about for the rest of his life, and try to name, and never quite managed to. "Something he started," she said, "that I have not finished yet." And then Rosin Ivers walked out across the snow toward the waiting light, and the boy stood and watched her go, and the wind came down off the mountains and began, gently, to fill in her prints behind her, one flake at a time, the way that country fills in everything given long enough, until there was nothing left along the airfield to say that she had ever passed that way at all. By dawn, the snow had taken her tracks completely. It took the tracks, and it took the blood, and in time it would take the story too, the way the snow takes everything, patiently and without mercy and without exception. But it never took the debt she paid on that mountain. It never took the 6 young men who grew old telling their children about the quiet medic who carried them out of the dark. It never took the name a dead legend spoken to the storm, with the last breath in his body, or the truth that came home behind it. Those things outlasted the winter. They outlasted the mountain. And somewhere to the east, under a grid square blacked out on a card in a young man's pocket, they were waiting still for a quiet woman with steady eyes to come and finish what had been started and to bring the last of them home.